Hi friends, if you're enjoying this series and you'd like to help me reach even more people with thinking faith, please consider supporting the show. Silver supporters get early access to episodes and bonus content. Gold supporters also get signed books and a monthly catch-up with me. The links to support are with the show notes or visit justinbrierley.com. Enjoy today's episode.
Ended up, as you say, joining a Wiccan coven. So what really happened was I still had a sense that this wasn't quite right. And then all sorts of strange things started happening to me. I had a dream about Jesus, and I thought, what was that about? I wrote it down. It was so very particular. And then I really started to have a sense that I was being dragged out of Wicca by something or someone and being told not to do this anymore. And I felt like I knew who it was, but I didn't want to think about that.
And the fact that I was up there after 101 days, it was the end. I asked for a sign and I received something that I never could have anticipated. I must say, if you bear in mind what I'd been doing for the last 25 years, I've been a wilderness rites of passage guide, I've been living in my tent. I'd seen many strange things out in the woods, but nothing out of the sky.
Welcome to the surprising rebirth of Belief in God podcast with me, Justin Brierley. It's another bonus holiday edition of the show today, before we begin our next act of the documentary series, looking at the story that shaped us with Tom Holland. That's in the new year. A real treat for you today, though. I'm speaking to two wonderful authors, both of them poets and deep thinkers, who have both recently been on a remarkable journey through mythology, storytelling, and some extraordinary personal experiences to adult conversion to Christianity. They are Paul Kingsnorth and Martin Shaw. If you've been listening closely to our series so far, you will have heard them both pop up on previous episodes, and I've been promising to share their full stories in more detail, and that's what we're doing on today's show. My interviews with Paul Kingsnorth and Martin Shaw were actually recorded separately, but feature so much overlap between them. They make the perfect pairing. In fact, they both refer to each other a few times during these conversations. Interestingly, their separate and quite recent conversions have also taken them both down similar routes when it comes to the church tradition they now call home, as you'll hear. Just before we get going, I want to remind you the surprising rebirth of Belief in God is also a book, and I was delighted that it was recently a finalist in Christianity Today's 2024 Book of the Year Awards. You can order the book and even get signed copies via my website, justinbrierley.com, where you can also subscribe to my newsletter and get chapter 1 for free. If you can support my work there, then as well as helping make this podcast possible, you'll also receive early access to the show each week, plus bonus content. Gold level supporters will also get signed copies of my books and the chance for a monthly catch-up with me, if you'd like it. Your support as we head towards 2024 does make a huge difference. Again, the links for the book, the newsletter, and to support are at justinbrierley.com, or just click the links with today's show. I believe we are seeing the first signs of a rebirth of belief in God in our day, and we'll return next time to our documentary format tracing that story. But the two conversations you'll hear today are, for me, signs of the first fruits of that wider openness and rediscovery of what Christianity can offer in the midst of our modern meaning crisis. Paul Kingsnorth is a celebrated author, poet and environmentalist who a few years ago surprised his readership by announcing his conversion to Orthodox Christianity, having spent some time as a Buddhist and even in Wicca. Paul now runs a lively Substack, The Abbey of Misrule, where he shares his writings and is much in demand as a speaker and author. This interview was first recorded for the Re-Enchanting podcast, presented by myself and Belle Tyndall. And we join the conversation as I ask Paul how it feels to be writing so frequently now about his newfound faith.
You're sort of working out your faith sort of in public as you go along.
Well, I do seem to be doing that, yeah, which is a bit awkward. That's the trouble with being a writer and then having something like this happen, is that you write about it and then more people ask you to write about it and then they ask you to come on their podcast and then you have to sort of explain yourself even when you don't know what you're doing. So you have to be a bit careful. Yeah. But it's, I don't know any other way to do it other than sort of writing it out and seeing what happens.
And nature and the great outdoors has always sort of been part of that journey, as far as I can see, in terms of the way it's woven into your books and your poetry. And I think just growing up, you were kind of you spent a lot of time in nature, didn't you?
Yeah, well, that was my dad's responsibility, really. He used to take me on very long walks when I was a kid, like two weeks long. We'd walk the Pennine Way or the Pembrokeshire Coast Path, which I walked when I was very young. Lots of beautiful long-distance paths all across Britain. And we do a lot of camping on the mountains. And so I was very immersed in it. I mean, I grew up in the suburbs of London and then High Wycombe, so a very ordinary kind of suburban life. But so going out into the hills was an escape from that. Yeah. And these were in the days when you could actually go out and nobody had a smartphone. So when you went up a mountain, you were up a mountain. You weren't someone tweeting on the top of it, right? So you were in the wilderness. Even in England, you could still get out into the wilderness to some degree. So I had a real sense of there was something. I always had a sense that there was something very powerful and very beautiful in nature. And then later on at school, I discovered Wordsworth, and Wordsworth was kind of putting words to these feelings, that there was something very profound. So I was a sort of pantheistic nature lover for a long time. I wouldn't call myself pantheistic anymore, but I still have the same sense that there's something very divine and sacred and beautiful in the natural world, and we've got a big problem when we're so divorced from it. So that was just the way that, if I look back now, I could say I think those were religious experiences, actually, but I would never have put it in those words.
Though you did have a sort of semi-teenage atheist sort of period.
Yeah, I mean, intellectually I did. I definitely went through my sort of Richard Dawkins phase before I'd heard of Richard Dawkins. You know, I thought it was very clever to explain to all the Christians why they were all so wrong. But that was just me being an idiot when I was 16. So I sort of grew out of it. I mean, I sort of believed it. I was somebody who I was spiritual but not religious, right? So I knew that organised religion was bad, but at the same time, I was never a sort of dematerialized rationalist person who thought that the world was just a gene bank.
You never thought nature was disenchanted?
No, I always thought, I always felt that there was something in the world that I could experience. And so, you know, I was a lover of fantasy novels, and I was very interested in ghosts and the supernatural, still am actually. And so all the other apparent dimensions that I was sure existed, I was always interested in that. But I would never have associated it with God or anything like that. That was not something that I thought I was interested in. I didn't have any religious upbringing, so and if I had done, I wouldn't have been interested anyway, because it didn't seem relevant. So and you know, when you're young, certainly back in the 80s, that's the kind of thing you're rebelling against, because that's the man. You're sticking it to the man. So you walk away from that. But no, I've never been sort of disenchanted, actually, in the sense that I ever thought the world was just a material thing. So as I say, I think right from the beginning I've had a religious sensibility, actually.
That's really interesting. So what was it about, because obviously you're in a different place now, but back then, what was it about Christianity that you were like, that won't tick any of my boxes? Like, there's nothing about Christianity that will explain or define anything that I'm feeling sort of in nature.
Well, I don't know, really. I mean, it wasn't just Christianity, it was anything at all. I mean, my best friend at school was a Muslim, and, you know, he was very committed to his religion in a sort of quiet way. And sometimes I'd go around his house and he'd have all his sort of praying garb on, and I'd sort of look at him and think, that's a bit weird. But, you know, it seems to make him happy. But I thought I was much cleverer than all that. And it wasn't... Look, I mean, I sort of had this... When I grew up in England in the 80s, there was a sort of Church of England-y thing going on. So there was always... You know, we had RE at school, and there were these two types of vicars that you would meet. There was the very stuffy old Victorian vicar who seemed to be coming from another world, and then there was the trendy vicar with the beard and the guitar who wanted to make Jesus your friend, and that was even worse. I much preferred the traditional vicar. I didn't want anything to do with the
I'm
trendy
literally
vicar.
picturing people I know.
Oh, there's lots around, and they'd come and do sermons about... I remember a particular one where someone wanted to compare Jesus to a bunch of bananas. I can't remember why, but it was terrible.
I'd love to know
it was
what
awful.
the analogy
was. And, you know,
was.
they'd always be quoting pop songs and things. It was really bad, and it was just cringe. It was very cringe, and so you just thought, what has this got to do with me? And it just sounded like morality lessons. That's all it was. Jesus says do this, and it's like, well, why do I need Jesus to tell me to do that? So it didn't seem relevant, but I wasn't looking for it. You know, I wasn't in that space where that was anything that interested me, so I could just have a good laugh about it. It wasn't something I felt like I needed, and no one had ever explained to me what it was. So Christianity or any other religion didn't seem. Sure. And, you know, back in the day, and probably still, the kind of the myth of progress is our story, and we're supposed to have transcended religion. That's a silly superstition that people used to have, and we've all gone beyond that now. And that's sort of what I probably complacently thought the world was, you know.
So before we get to your own point at which you changed your mind, your life was very much shaped by nature, by your concern for it, ecology, environmentalism, and so on. Over time, though, I think you became a bit disillusioned with the movement. So do you want to talk us through sort of what happened on that level, where that passion came from, but what made you want to sort of...
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things, really. I mean, if we go back to the sense that that in nature you can see the divine, which I think is now what was going on.
Yeah.
Nature is the book of God. If God is an artist, which I think he probably is, then nature is his artwork, right? And we're part of it, incidentally, because we're natural too. So I had a sense that that's what it was. That was what was going on. So I had a very inchoate sense that nature was a sacred thing in some way. I wouldn't necessarily have used that word. But when I saw a forest being destroyed to make toilet paper, that felt like sacrilege. It still does. It seems like a violent, stupid abuse of the world, and a worship of mammon and all of the other things that we would see now. And so I wanted to protect it, and so that led to me becoming an activist, and my writing got diverted into a long period of using my writing to try and talk about that, fiction, non-fiction, poetry, whatever, almost activist writing, but also just trying to explain the importance of the sacred in nature. And so I was involved in the green movement for a long time. I suppose I became disillusioned firstly because it became clear that the scale of the destruction wasn't something we were going to change. Right. We're not going to stop the climate changing now at this point. And that kind of activism doesn't work on a large scale. It can work on a small scale. But so there was a sense that it was sort of past the point of no return. But more than that, it was a sense that the green movement has gone down, the mainstream anyway, it's a very broad movement, but the mainstream of the green movement has gone down a very technocratic road in which we have this thing called environmentalism, and we talk about, in very technical terms, about biodiversity and carbon credits, and so we've taken this sacred divine manifestation of natural beauty and turned it into a sort of a cold dead accounting thing where we've all got to be sustainable and reduce our carbon, and the solution to the problem is always more technology. It's always putting wind farms on the mountains.
Changing our
It's never
lifestyle.
about changing our lifestyle. It's never about having less. It's never about seeing nature as something that is more than a...
Right.
I was an environmentalist because I believed nature was something that should be protected because it just obviously should, because it was... I'd say that's a religious sensibility, but you don't have to have a religion to see that. It's a normal human reaction, I think. And I still think that. And I think much of the environmental movement has become so obsessed with carbon and technology that it's got lost. It thinks that covering mountains in wind farms is a good solution, because what it actually wants to do is sustain technological society going forward, making us all richer and wealthier. And actually, I think that what we need to do is have a lot less and live more simply. But that's virtually impossible in the society we live in. It's been made very, very hard to do that. So I think it's about relationship. Our relationship with nature is very broken. And if we have a relationship with the rest of nature, which just sees it as something that can be calculated and sorted out with technology, then we've done to nature the same thing we've kind of done to our culture, which has turned it into a machine. So that was my disillusion, really.
Yeah, so I guess, sort of to really oversimplify what you're saying, but to make sure I've got it right in my head, is that it's not about what the environmental movement at the moment is. It's about using the machine in a sort of a better way, rethinking how we use it in a sustainable way, rather than thinking, actually, is it a machine to be used in general, or is it something completely different?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, what are we trying to do? Are we trying to create a giant technological digital society which doesn't produce carbon and is sustainable, or are we looking at our way of life, our modern way of life, which I always have, and said, actually, no, this is the wrong way to live.
Yeah.
We're so disconnected from nature, we're so atomized and isolated and dependent on our technology that we've broken a lot of relationships, human and non-human. That's what I always felt. And a lot of environmentalists still obviously do feel that, but the mainstream of the movement has gone down.
And it feels like
path.
that's only sped up in the last few years.
Yeah, it really has. It's sped up very fast since COVID. I think everything's become even more digitized than before. We're living on screens even more than before, and the future is just taking us in that direction. And it's the wrong direction.
If all we're doing in our environmental activity is kind of ensuring we can sustain this world.
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
so what do you want to sustain?
Yeah.
What do you want to sustain? I mean, what does sustain mean? It just means make something that can keep going. So what are you trying to sustain? Are you trying to sustain the natural world, or are you trying to sustain this technological
existence
machine.
we've created.
Are you
for
trying
ourselves?
to sustain capitalism or progress or growth or wealth? What are you trying to sustain? And that's what sustainability actually now means, is making modern Western capitalist technological society bulletproof, almost shockproof. Get rid of the carbon, use something else instead. But that's a technological question. It's not a deeper one. What's our actual relationship with nature is the question I want to answer.
Yeah. You talk about how that got worse after COVID, and that's such a shame, because I remember in the midst of it, it felt like, oh, this could be a moment, like we're...
There was a moment right at the beginning, wasn't there?
Yeah,
there was.
And the clouds, that we weren't living in the smog and all that.
Absolutely.
That's very true. And there was a moment at the beginning where the cars weren't on the roads and people went home and spent time with their children, and you thought, oh, actually, look at all the stuff I'd forgotten about. Yeah, exactly.
And seeing how nature reacted to us shrinking was such a beautiful thing, and we were all so enchanted with it at the time. So it's such a shame that hasn't.
Yeah, but then we got straight back on the bandwagon.
We got straight back on it.
Yeah, we're not very good at learning those sorts of lessons.
No, humans are very bad at learning from their mistakes, aren't they? I think that's a good lesson from history, unfortunately. We do that.
Well, just before we get into the rest of today's show, someone we've heard from quite a bit on the podcast is author and speaker Glenn Scrivener. Hello, Glenn.
Hey, Justin. Always great to be here.
Well, for a while now, you've been happily pointing people to your online course 321. Where did that come from?
It's a passion of mine to help people get to grips with Christian faith and to do it in a way that's attractive and imaginative and deep and that assumes no prior knowledge. So 321 is my way of showing life according to Jesus. We want it to be like a mere Christianity for a digital age.
Okay, so that sounds like it's maybe more for those who are not Christians?
Well, yeah, many people have done it who are not Christians, and they've found faith for the first time. We're thrilled about that. But like with Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, Christians love that book too. And the first audience we have in mind for 321 is actually a Christian who wants to be refreshed in their faith and to have something to pass on to their Christian curious friends and family.
Okay, so Christian or not, this basically gets people to the heart of the faith.
Right, and nearly 10,000 people have joined the online platform. It's free. You watch these video-led sessions and you think through the stunning animations, you engage with the chat community, you get a ton of extra content thrown in, and now you have on your phone a Mere Christianity that you can share with others. So the phrase we're using is, you can share this without shame, without cost, and without delay.
Well, we've been really enjoying promoting 321, and listeners to this podcast can get into it instantly by going to 321course.com/JB. That's 321course.com/JB. Thanks, Glenn.
Oh, thank you, Justin. Keep up the good work.
Talk to us about your own journey when it comes to faith, though, Paul, because I know that you have sort of had a religious sense about you over your adult life, and it's had expression in lots of different ways. Even sort of Wicca at one point, you were sort of out in the woods doing sort of nature worship and that kind of thing. I think you've also, had a period where Buddhism has been kind of quite central to your life. Mm-hmm. So, having gone through all of those different ways of engaging, what made you arrive at Christianity?
Well, I suppose that this sense of the sacred or the divine or this religious sense, whatever you call it, which has always been with me, it just became stronger as I got older. The more I thought about, if you approach, say you're looking at the environmental crisis and you start saying, well, why is this happening then? You sort of cycle through a lot of questions, and if you keep asking the questions, you say, well, maybe it's politics, maybe we need someone else in power, and then you realise it's not that, and then you say, well, maybe we need a revolution. Well, no, that's not going to happen, and it probably would make it worse. Maybe it's about capitalism. Well, it is, but it's bigger than that as well. Maybe it's about industrialism. Yeah, it sort of is that, but it's bigger than that as well. You keep going down and down and down, and you realise that, as I say, I think that what's the crisis is not technological or economic or political. It's cultural, which means actually it's spiritual, because it's about our relationship with the rest of life and what we think a human is and what we think nature is and what we think the world is. And then that's a theological question. That's a spiritual question. So by the time I was 40 or so, I thought, well, I think I need to go and I need a spiritual path here. I think I need to learn from the wisdom of the ages, because there's something bigger going on. So yeah, I the first place I went was Buddhism, which is often the case with Western people these days, because Buddhism is very accessible. So I spent about 5 or 6 years studying Zen and practicing Zen and Chan Buddhism, which was very, very productive, and I did learn a lot, and I had a lot of experiences. I especially learned a lot about the nature of the self. Buddhism is very good at teaching you the nature of the kind of the false self. But there was also something missing from it, and I wasn't sure what it was, but I sort of realised to my horror that maybe it was God. I thought, no, this can't be true. No. So I didn't want to use that word, but I thought, well, I don't know. I sort of wanted to worship something, which I thought was a bit weak of me. But there was a lack of relationship somehow in Buddhism for me. There wasn't a relationship to I felt like there was a source of something. There was something big going on, and I didn't have a relationship with Buddhism. So at the same time I was studying, I was reading mythology, I was going on 4-day retreats in the woods, 4 days of fasting in Dartmoor, in the woods, and doing all sorts of other things as well. And eventually I ended up thinking, well, look, maybe I need a nature religion, right? Because I love nature. I should have a nature religion. That might work. So I've always been very interested in sort of magic and things. So I ended up, as you say, joining a Wiccan coven. So a sort of new age witchy thing for a while. For a couple of years I did that. And that was interesting as well. I learned some things from that. But Wicca is a sort of false, made-up religion with lots of different aspects of things cobbled together from kind of the Masons and Aleister Crowley and all sorts of other stuff like that. So some of it's interesting, but some of it's a bit sinister. You don't realise that till you're in it. Not deliberately so, but I think that kind of thing is playing with powers that the people involved in it don't necessarily realise they're playing with. Okay. But anyway, what really happened was I still had a sense that this wasn't quite right. And then all sorts of strange things started happening to me. I had a dream about Jesus, and I thought, what was that about? I wrote it down. It was so very particular. Then I started having sort of... Weirdly, I kept meeting Christians everywhere, so I felt like something was happening, right? So I felt like all these Christians were coming towards me. At the time, I was running this writing class, and suddenly I had all these priests saying, "Can you help me with my writing?"
Don't you hate it when that happens?
Terrible. I know, they're everywhere. And then I do things like discovering that friends of mine who I hadn't known were Christian were actually Christian, and then all sorts of stuff. And then suddenly it was Christians everywhere, and I was going, "What's going on?" And then I really started to have a sense that I was being dragged out of Wicca by something or someone, and being told not to do this anymore. And I felt like I knew who it was, but I didn't want to think about that. But a lot of things happened to me, to cut a long story short, and it was partly a sort of intellectual dissatisfaction with what I was doing, but more than that, it was actually a lot of experiences. I felt like I was being really forcibly dragged towards Christianity. And C.S. Lewis wrote about this very famously, didn't he? For fearing the approach of the one who he desperately desired not to meet. It was a bit like that.
Yes.
So in the end, I just thought, maybe I'm a Christian. Damn, this is bad. I don't want to be a Christian. Don't like Christians. Don't like this. This is bad. But, then, of course, I started to look into Christianity and start reading getting into the real meat of it. And then, of course, you realise that it's not what you thought it was, and that the depth of it and the cosmology of it is really not what you thought you learned at school. And it's very badly communicated to us, unfortunately.
The trendy vicars didn't have the whole story.
I appreciate their efforts, but it wasn't. The attempt to make Christianity relevant just makes it less relevant. Anyway, so I just started looking around and walking into churches and sitting at the back and things. And eventually, I walked into an Orthodox monastery, a new Orthodox monastery that's opened in Ireland, the first one, very small, just a few minutes from my home actually, and I went to the Divine Liturgy, and I'd never experienced anything like that before, and after you've been to 2 or 3 you can't stop, and here I am. Now I turn out to be an Orthodox Christian, and it's interesting, there's a friend of mine, Martin Shaw, who you've spoken to before, and he's also recently become an Orthodox Christian after 10 years of being a sort of pagan storyteller. I know Martin very well, and somebody asked him recently, they said, "Why did you convert to Christianity then?" And he said, "I don't think I did. I think I just realised I was a Christian all along." And I kind of feel the same, actually. I kind of feel like when you join the Orthodox Church, people say, "Welcome home." It's very nice. And it's a weird thing in one way, because I'm a member of the Romanian Orthodox Church. It's not my home. I'm not Romanian. Yeah. But in another way, in a deeper way, it does feel like that. It feels like you've come back to something you sort of always knew. It's very prodigal son. You sort of feel like you're coming back to something. I did anyway. So I don't feel like I've converted to something weird and new and strange at all. I feel like I've gone,
this was what it was all about.
This is where I came from. This is what I've been circling around my whole life. So it's a strange feeling. And I'm quite a new Christian. Only 2 or 3 years I've been in the church. So I'm still very much feeling my way, but it's...
Jump straight into a
it's the only way to do it.
Theological
Let's throw yourself in. You have to go in at the deep end. When you're my age, it's like I wish I'd started 30 years ago, but anyway. You've got
There's so much interesting about what you just said. So many interesting parts. But I think that trust that you have had in yourself, in your inner monologue, that's really interesting. And I think that might, if anyone's listening to this who's not a Christian, as Christians, we kind of take that quite seriously, this idea that God speaks, and that this whole, deep to deep type sort of thing. But if you're not a Christian, that's quite countercultural to sort of listen to your inner monologue and think there's a real weight here, and actually this might be more than just me. This might be some kind of external force trying to communicate with me.
Yeah, I think that's the countercultural bit, isn't it? Because we're very good at listening to our inner monologue when it's about us. We're very good at a sort of psychotherapizing, individualistic, sort of moralistic deism thing. But yeah, the notion that there might be a God and he might be talking to you. I mean, I sort of resisted that idea for a long time. It sounds a bit mad, and also maybe I'm hugely self-absorbed and I think I'm a prophet or something. And what's going on? Why would God be talking to me? There was all that going on as well. But I don't know. I've always just thought if you're going in I just sort of started praying at some point in a crude way and just saying, okay, well, if you're real, tell me what to do. Show me what's going on. Tell me where I should go then. I think it's sort of the only thing you can do. But I think for a long time I'd just been looking. I've been searching for so long. I just thought I've got to follow whatever comes. What's the worst that can happen? I'll just be wrong and then I can go and do something else. But what it turns out that if you start praying, you get an answer, which is actually quite frightening. So that was what happened, I think.
It reminds me a bit of that C.S. Lewis passage. I can't remember it very well, but where he sort of talks about the fact that a lot of people want a kind of God that's a sort of impersonal force or a sort of God in their own mould that doesn't challenge them too much. But then when people discover this kind of untamed living God on the end of the line, that's a very kind of different concept, because that suddenly means, I'm not in the driving seat anymore. There is something beyond me.
Aslan is not a safe lion.
Yes, it's not a tame lion.
It's not a tame lion. No,
yeah.
Exactly. No, that's the thing. You see, so it's a radical kind of discovery that prayer's a thing. Prayer actually is a real thing. Because again, at school, it's a funny thing. I'm not really blaming anyone, but no one taught you what any of this was really. You just go to assembly and they go, right, let us pray, and you go, what does that mean? What am I supposed to do? I just say these words. But yeah, actually trying to talk and then thinking like something might actually have happened as a response to that, as a result of that. I mean, it's a weird,
I'm
very
fascinated
countercultural thing. Actually,
I've got kids, and the thought often goes through my mind, when they're at school, and they do happen to go to a Church of England school. But lots of their friends obviously have absolutely no faith and don't come from church families and so on. And I sometimes wonder, going through those, things, prayer, your hymn or whatever, what impact does it make? Obviously on you, it had very little impact. And yet, at the same time, I don't want that to just disappear entirely from our cultural experience.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is interesting, because you say it had little impact, but I'm not sure that's true. I didn't think it had any impact at the time. I wasn't interested in it, but it did give me a foundation in what Christianity broadly was.
Yes,
I had to learn the Lord's Prayer at school, so I always knew that. And I'd listen to the Gospels. I wasn't very interested, but I'd hear the stories, and I had to do the nativity play and sing some hymns, and that gives you a basic foundation of Christianity, actually. Which I don't think is available for a lot of children these days, actually. Yes. I think that the younger generation often now haven't even got that foundation. So stuff we took for granted, like, a quote from the Bible or something that Jesus said, regardless of whether you're a Christian, it's kind of in the language. It's like Shakespeare. It's here. So I think it did have an impact on me. It didn't, at the time, I didn't think it had any spiritual impact on me, but it gave me a sort of ground of just understanding what that story is that I could then come back to later and go, right, okay, I want to dig deeper into it. But I sort of, at least I knew the broad outline of what the picture was. So I think it did have an impact in that way, actually.
Yeah.
A cultural, gives you a cultural grounding. Even if you reject it, it's still there. Yeah. If you want to come back, you can come back. So, I do think that matters, actually.
So do you think there are many more people who sort of have always been a Christian in sort of what you said, those people who, despite their expectations and their wants, because, people will be reluctant, that it's already within them?
Well, I suppose we'll find out, won't we? I mean, what I think is, if God is real, then God is real, and that means everybody has a longing for God. And actually I think that's true, because I think even if you look at it anthropologically, historically, every culture in the world is built around God in some way.
Yeah.
They may have a different understanding of it. They may be wrong or right about this, that, or the other, but they're all focusing at some point on where they think the divine is. It's always at the heart of every culture, except this one, which has decided to pretend that's not real for a bit. But that's not going to work, because I think humans have a need for it. They have a need for God because that's what we're supposed to do. That's where we're supposed to be orientated. So if that's true, then we're going to want to look in that direction, even though the whole culture is telling us that that's nonsense. We sort of know it isn't, but we don't. It's very difficult to know where to look in this society. But I do think possibly that's true, because since I started writing about this and talking about it, I didn't really intend to go around writing and talking about Christianity all the time. It just seems to have happened, and I thought, well, maybe I should do it because maybe that's what I'm supposed to do with this writing thing I have. Maybe that's what God wants me to do, or maybe I should just do it to help others out. But since I've started doing it, I've had a lot of letters and emails. I can't even answer them all, from people who are in a similar sort of position on a similar journey, often coming from a similar place, who said, yes, much to my horror and surprise, I'm also attracted to Christianity. What do I do? And I can't really help, but except by telling the story. And just by talking like this, other people can look and say, oh, yeah, maybe it's all right. Maybe it's not just me. Maybe I'm not mad.
We spoke to Francis Spufford earlier in the series, and he said something quite similar. Well, he basically said sometimes it's about having people who aren't the people you'd expect, maybe, to start talking about Christianity, that suddenly opens it up for people. And he obviously, is a brilliant writer and so on. And I think it was a refreshing when suddenly he wrote about Christianity in his book Unapologetic, and in a very different, unique way as well. And we've also mentioned Nick Cave a few times on this podcast.
A few times.
But if you're listening, Nick, the door's still open to the interview.
Been mentioned like 6 times now.
But again, someone who I think, very influential pop star, rock star, but seems to kind of just be voicing what I think a lot of people are feeling deep down. No, maybe there is a God. Maybe this feeling. And I kind of also recognizing, like so many people, that, as you say, we're the only culture that has kind of banished God, but we're still no less religious. We're just getting religious about different things.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
And it's not like that instinct goes away. It just gets subverted in some way.
No.
I mean, what are you seeing in terms of that? Would you say, I don't know, do you think we're ready for the real God story to come back in our culture?
Well, that's a good question, isn't it? Chesterton was arguing with Marx. He said it's not true that religion is the opium of the people. It's irreligion, which is the opium of the people, because if you don't worship something beyond the world, you will worship the world. And above all, you will worship the strongest thing in the world, which is true. So it's true. You get your religious gaze directed towards, well, this is what idol worship is, right? That you start worshipping the world instead. What we worship is money. We worship wealth. Above all, I think we worship technology. And you can see where that's going. That's going towards transhumanism, artificial intelligence, the attempt to create our own God, to be God, in fact. That's where we're going. And I think that the more that is openly the case, the more that we try to remake human nature, remake nature itself, behave like gods, the more people are going to start saying, well, hang on a minute, what actually is happening here? The more you have to ask this question, what is a human? What is nature? What is the world? And that's going to focus a lot of people's minds, and I think it already is. I think people will be ready for actual serious Christianity again, full strength Christianity, not the weak worldly version, the real thing. And I think it's starting to happen. I can feel it, especially amongst younger people, interestingly. In my generation, younger people, I've heard so many stories. I mean, even somebody like Jordan Peterson, who isn't a Christian, although we can't stop talking about it for some reason. I don't know what's going on there, but he'll give lectures about the 2-hour lectures about the book of Genesis, and it'll fill up with 20-year-olds. That would never have happened 20 years ago, even 5 years ago. There's something going on that's pulling people towards it. I mean, it seems to have happened to me, and I think it's happening to a lot of other people as well. So I think it's like the more worldly we become, the more we worship the world, the more we start to do increasingly dark and disturbing things, trying to live forever, upload our minds into the cloud, create new life itself, the more this sort of pull towards actual faith, an actual God rather than the false one, is gonna be stronger. I think. I have a feeling that's happening already.
And you said then full strength Christianity. You found a pull to quite an ancient form of Christianity. what is it that you're finding there that you don't see in like sort of more modern Christianity? Christianity, again, to mention a previous guest, Tom Holland, Christianity that you said has bled itself with enchantment. I think you might have called it a bleached out Christianity.
I think so, yeah, it feels like that.
Can you talk us through sort of what you're finding?
It's a funny thing because, I'm English, so maybe I should have been Anglican, and I live in Ireland, so maybe I should be Catholic. And I was looking around at all the churches. You become a Christian, you think, well, what's the church then? There seem to be about 100 of them. What's the actual real one? Where should I be going here? So I was praying a lot about that, but I was also going to churches and sitting in them and seeing what happened. And eventually, as I said, I went to this Orthodox monastery, and that was a very powerful experience. I met a priest there, and I talked to him, and I just kept going and going and going. And there was an experience in the Divine Liturgy in the Orthodox Church which I haven't had anywhere else. The Orthodox liturgy is usually at least 2 hours long. You stand up all the way through, right? The Orthodox Easter service will start at 10 p.m. and finish at 2 a.m. No messing around with the Orthodox. Sometimes people ask me the difference between Eastern and Western Christianity. I say Eastern Christians have better beards and stronger legs.
Fair enough.
That's fundamentally the difference.
Yeah.
But there's something. Orthodox Christianity comes from the East, and it's two things have happened there. Firstly, it's been persecuted for much of its history by Islam or later by communism, which has made it very strong, paradoxically. It hasn't had very much power. And secondly, it hasn't had to deal with modernity. It didn't have a Reformation, didn't have the Enlightenment, didn't have the Renaissance. So it hasn't been sort of hacked about by humanism, basically, in the same way. And so and it also has a much more mystical core, I think, than Western Christianity. Obviously, there's mysticism in Western Christianity too, but generally, I think it's ended up, especially in the Protestant countries, much more moralistic and rationalistic. And that was the sort of Christianity that I came across at school, I think. It's a sort of list of moral rules. And obviously the moral rules matter in Christianity, but they're not the heart of the thing. They exist for a reason. And I found in the Orthodox faith, firstly, something which hasn't been compromised and muddied around by the modern world, but also something which can take you really much deeper than I've ever experienced in the Western Church. And I think, especially in the West since the 60s, the Church, all the churches, the Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, all of them have tried to, I don't know if they've tried to compromise with modernity, but they've tried to make the church more appealing. We've got that's the trendy vicars, right? And I don't blame them. It's a sort of rational thing to do. They think, well, no one's interested in the church anymore. Maybe if we make the hymns sound like pop songs, people will come back. But they won't, because they just want the pop songs. And then the church looks weak. So weirdly enough, the more the church has tried to speak to or adapt itself to secular modernity, the more it's just seemed like a compromised thing that doesn't have anything alternative to say. Whereas now, I think when people are looking at Christianity, they say, look, what's the alternative to the world? Which is actually what Christianity is supposed to be, right? St. Paul says, don't be conformed to this world. The church is not the world. It's in the world, but it's not of the world. So we're not supposed to be conformed to the world. And now that the world is becoming so awful in so many ways, people will say, well, where's the temple of God? What's happening in the temple of God? And if it's the same thing as is happening in the world, if it's just activist politics or, pop songs or whatever, then why would you go? Has it remained, if it's the word of God, it should remain unchanged, right? And it should be strong and it should be beautiful as well. The other thing about Orthodoxy is there's a great deal of beauty in it. The icons and the incense, it's a kind of full bodily experience that really feels very powerful. So there's something in there that I think we have lost in the West or given away.
You can find links to Paul Kingsnorth and the full interview on the Re-Enchanting podcast from today's show notes. My next guest has a story that overlaps with Paul Kingsnorth in several ways, as you'll hear. Martin Shaw is a renowned storyteller and mythologist. With his full beard, broad-rimmed hat and a twinkle in his eye, he looks the part of a travelling bard of old. But in the last couple of years, he has had his own quite extraordinary story to tell too. After many years as a poet, author and teaching others through the West Country School of Myth, Martin had an encounter that confounded all of his expectations. We pick up the story as I ask Martin about his love of storytelling and mythology.
Thanks to Gareth, who wrote in to say, whether you're a person of faith, agnostic, atheist, or none of the above, this series is both genuinely thought-provoking and inspiring. I could not recommend it highly enough. Leaving a review wherever you get your podcasts or simply posting about us on your social media helps others to discover the show. If you want to follow more of my work, why not get my fortnightly newsletter? I'll even send you the first chapter of The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God book for free when you subscribe. And if you'd like to support the show, you can get early access episodes and bonus content. Gold supporters will receive signed copies of both my books. For the newsletter and to support, visit justinbrierley.com or the links with today's show. Is that something that was there from early on, this sense of wanting to explore mythology, folklore, stories and so on?
Yes, and I think probably not having a telly was a great contributor to that, because if I could have got my hands on the television more regularly, I don't think that I would have spent as much time in the woods as I did. I don't think I would have spent as much time reading books and listening to stories and being around it. But I'd had an experience where I'd been walking with my dad early one morning and he'd recited a poem. And as he recited it, the sun came up. Now, in my 5-year-old mind, this was an extraordinary act of sympathetic magic. My dad had done that. Certain words, beautifully expressed, bumped into everything around us and caused a reaction. And I used to see the same thing when my mum was reading me a story at night. I'd see the moon come out, and in my little associative mind, I thought there was a relationship, and I think there probably still was, between the movement of the moon and the words of my mum.
So that was the way it expressed itself when you were growing up. Did you find yourself drawn in, as you began reading for yourself, to sort of storytelling, fantasy literature? What was your own engagement with the stories that people tell?
Well, I didn't know that storytellers existed in the fashion that I am one today, but there were well-meaning ladies in libraries that would read you a story. But there's a difference between being read a story and being told a story. There's a difference between a recital and an imagining. And it was the imagining that I was excited about. I went to a church called Upton Vale Baptist Church in Torquay in the mid-70s. And I remember often, I would have been whisked off to Sunday school, but there was a day where I remember somehow I was trapped in the adult sermon. And I could see that the sermon was of great, substance for folks several generations older. But I had this fantasy that Aslan was going to burst through a window, grab the preacher by the scruff of the neck, not kill them, but just generally shake up the oxygen of the room. And so I was at the Christianity and the stories I was experiencing through Christianity. I think in reflection, Justin, there was a bit of a disconnect between the kind of radical, actually countercultural message of Yeshua, of Jesus, this strange Galilee druid, and the incredibly sort of domestic and rather urban and settled setting that had encrusted itself around this very strange Middle Eastern mystery religion.
So you were already, I suppose, at a young age, sort of were sensing something that what you were being showed in the church that you perhaps grew up in didn't feel like the wild, untamed kind of story that you obviously already had a sense that Christianity might be about.
Yeah, I mean, I did love the stories, I think. I remember David and Goliath and things like that. But they didn't do to my soul what a fairy tale would do, or a great myth like the Odyssey. And Jesus himself was speaking of such a high bar, of such sort of interior discipline. I knew I would be terrible at that. I used to describe Christ as the first alien that ever visited Earth, because he seemed so unusual to me. He didn't seem like the other gods that I encountered in stories. So I think, it seemed an urban, well-masticated, well-chewed faith with a tremendous emphasis on belief. But the trouble was, when I was, 6, I didn't believe in anything for more than a few minutes. I didn't even believe entirely that I was a boy. I thought I may be a hawk. or I was, some goblin that lived in the forest. And so actually that kind of evangelical pressure froze my artistic soul, to be honest. And another thing is that although I appreciate now actually the Baptists can really deliver a good sermon. There's real content. It's fantastic. Now I appreciate it now, but I was not aware of a contemplative tradition. I wasn't aware of the saints, really. I wasn't aware of wild old women living in the desert. I wasn't aware of the first 300 years of Christianity and the strangeness of that story. And for some reason for me, although obviously the traditional description of the church is the body of Christ, I used to look out the window and think, well, is a meadow of wildflowers the body of Christ? Is a mountain range the body of Christ? Is the bottom of the sea part of the body of Christ? What does Creator actually think? Is Christianity allowed to exist in the wild places as well as the breathlessly human?
Yes. So you were kind of experiencing this disjunct between the sort of domesticated version, as it were, of Christianity and this sense that you had that there might be something else out there, something bigger and wilder. I mean, you've already intimated that you did grow up in that sense in a Christian setting, but did that faith just kind of not stick for the kinds of reasons you've described? Did it sort of, obviously you had loving parents, as far as I understand, who wanted, I'm sure, to pass on the faith as best they could, but for whatever reason, it didn't quite fit your personality and that artistic soul that you describe.
Wonderfully, Justin, I'm realizing as you're saying this to me that my parents, they did pass it on. The message was received. It just took half a century. But yes, at that time, it seemed tamed, unromantic, book laden. The people of the book. I wanted to look out. I knew I had a feeling for God, but I knew that I needed to feel it in the face of a flower or an animal or the movement of the weather or a dream. Now, of course, there'll be many Christians rolling their eyes at this point and saying that's all in the Bible, but certain parts of the Bible are highlighted more than others, and I just hadn't really sifted to consciousness. So actually, by the time I was 17, I remember my last day in church, actually, when I thought, no, I need to go walkabout. And I remained on walkabout for, I suppose, another best part of 35 years. Yeah.
What were the stories that were capturing your imagination then? You mentioned a few, the Odyssey and others. Where did you find that those sparks of joy were to be found?
Well, funnily enough, I found those sparks of joy initially from the very man that wanted me to be a Christian. It was my dad, because once he'd been preaching and we were walking home, he'd say, well, in this forest, Morgana Le Fay is just behind a tree. And isn't this a little bit like the King Arthur stories? So my heart was kind of wired romantically very early and without any effort whatsoever. It was just so natural. I swooned into it. I wasn't pressured into it. That's a good, I'm going to remember this. I swooned into it. I wasn't pressured into it. It was a movement of the heart, not fear-laden. I didn't smell sulfur and that I was going to be chucked into, the ninth rung of hell. So then I got older and I realized that Irish stories, stories of someone called Finn McCool, Russian fairy tales, they actually had tremendous complexity to them. And there's the dichotomy that some Christians have where everything you could possibly need in terms of how to live exists within the Bible, and everything outside is to be viewed with suspicion or potentially even Luciferic. That was not the atmosphere that I grew up in. I grew up in much more of the perspective of Augustine, which is, all truth is God's truth. Yeah. And actually radiating through the strangest stories for many thousands of years before the advent of these 33 years that we have lived in the shock of ever since, there were all sorts of pinpricks of eternity. So to be honest, unconsciously, I started to gravitate towards the grace that was in all of these other stories.
Yeah. I mean, you're obviously an imaginative, artistic soul. I almost have this vision of you, Martin, as a sort of wild man of the woods, kind of, just exploring nature, inviting others into this journey. You've obviously had, though, you've gone the academic route. You've done the PhD. You've obviously established a school of mythology and storytelling as well. What have you been hoping to pass on in the decades that you've had that? And I know that there was one specifically very important encounter, I think, in Snowdonia, where the mythic imagination really came to be central for your life. Do you want to just talk us through that? Because I think that's important before we kind of get to the second, if you like, epiphany in your journey.
Yes, well, I had gone up at 23. I'd gone up to a mountain in Snowdonia. Let's call it a big hill called Cutta Idris, and around that area, I had fasted for 4 days and nights, and that, although to some people listening, they'll think, well, what on earth is that? It's no great mystery that all around the world for thousands of years, certainly Christians included, it's often a very healthy thing for a period of time to get away from your job description, to get away from your family, to get away from all of that, sit quietly on a hill till you locate the still small voice. I mean, Jesus's relationship to towns it's very interesting. He's always slipping out. He's always slipping out early in the morning. That was one of the I always noticed that these how compressed the Bible is in its language. So absolutely, but I always noticed that. So I went through a huge epiphany. I was a musician. I returned my record contract, and then actually lived in a tent for 4 years at the very end of the 1990s, just before there would have been a phone in my pocket or an email address. It was still time when you could actually disappear. So I lived in this black tent to digest quite what had happened to me. Now, as you're talking to me, Justin, I'm thinking about something. I'm thinking about mystical experience and theoretical knowledge. And I think the reason why I went the way of a mythologist and I got a doctorate and the rest of it was because I needed to comb through the encounter that I'd had in a language that was communicable to other people, because actually I was rendered speechless by it. And so I've been thinking about this recently, how God places you in positions to learn things long before you realize the big picture of why you're going through this. And so I was just led into mythology. I was led back into the stories of my youth to explain an ineffable mystery that I'd entered up there in the woods. And then I trained in that work for 8 years. And so now I have the full gamut of, on the one hand, leading wilderness fasts, of which I'm about to lead my first Christian one in August, specifically for Christians, right the way through to postgraduate courses and people that are looking from a much more poetical or theoretical basis of mind.
And during this period of your life, how did you regard Christ? As another myth among many? What was the sort of way in which you sort of thought about that?
He's definitely not he's not a myth amongst many. And when sort of, I'm sorry to be, when people's knowledge of mythology is primarily being plucked from YouTube, when there isn't a great deal of how people can say with a kind of great wave of the hand, well, of course, you also have Osiris and you have Dionysus and all of this stuff. Speaking as someone that has a new version of the Bacchae coming out, Euripides' play on Dionysus, very soon, I can tell you that those figures, although there's an ornamental connection through things like the vine and wine, you're never in a million years going to encounter something like the Sermon on the Mount coming out of Dionysus' mouth. I found Christ disturbing. There's a poet I know whose name I won't mention her, but you'd know who she was. But she said to me, I think in a very strange way, Christ is the last of the Greek gods and turns everything before sort of on its head. And of course, just stating the obvious, of course, Jesus was a Jew, but I knew what she was getting at. I knew what she was getting at. So actually, I knew enough to know that the Christ story didn't fit neatly with any of the other mythologies that I was exploring, although there was connective thread. What disturbed me about the Gospels was that it sounded awfully like they had a postcode to them. Do you know what I'm saying? It's very site-specific. You don't get this in the Gnostic Gospels. The Gnostic Gospels were all floating around like astronauts, and it's the same old, same old. If you've read mystical content, you've read that before. Okay. But the Gospels are gnarly and strange, and they're all happening in an area that you can walk around. You can walk around with a map. Yeah. And I thought, oh, that's a little bit too much like real life for me. I better stay away from it.
So real life came calling, though. Why don't you take us up to what happened a couple of years ago now? Because this is both, I guess, a spiritual, intellectual, experiential journey that you went on. Maybe take us, from wherever you want to in that story and how Christ presented himself in a very real way to you, Martin.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let's go back. It now many years have passed. I'm at the end of my 40s. Providentially, I've ended up earning a living doing something I really love. I've been a tutor at Stanford. I think by then I'd written about 16 books. Absolutely known in my world, absolutely known as of my generation, the guy that's doing this particular type of work. But then I had an odd sensation. I don't know where it came from, to spend 101 days visiting a local Dartmoor forest. Now, you can remember, Justin, that I'm a veteran of sitting out in the bush. But the trouble is, if you do anything in life over and over and over again, there'll come a day when you get to the back of the wardrobe and it's just fur coats and the back of the wardrobe. And the wilderness vigil, to some degree, I knew it so well, I needed to do something else to tripwire my own heart again, to tripwire my own imagination. And so I knew 101 day vigil in the forest was going to do something that I hadn't encountered before. And so through the end of 2019 and the winter of 2020, I was visiting this forest every day, primarily to listen. Again, I know how that may sound very airy-fairy, but it's just part of it's just how I am. I listen to woods because I'm aware that if you go into a forest of oak trees, for the last few hundred years, they just had people looking at them as bits of 2x4 and looking at them and thinking, well, you'll make a nice boat or a ship. And so I wanted to go and actually tell stories back to a place. So lots of Dartmoor stories, lots of poems. And then, and I don't want to overlabor this because if I talk about this, what happens too much, it'll become a story. Yeah. And you understand. In a way, it's so precious. What I can say is on the last night of the vigil, I went into the very center of the woods, which there was an old Iron Age fort. And I had a profound, shatteringly beautiful encounter. Now, I must emphasize that I hadn't been fasting at this point. I'd had a meal. I was content. Between me and you, I was glad the thing was almost over. That was the mood. The mood was thanks, bye-bye, glad it's done. But I just, in my own way, I prayed and I said, if there's anything, and I would use the word like creator, if there's anything you really need me to see or absorb at this moment, please announce it. Please announce it. And what happened then was I was looking out at the night sky and I was looking at we all know what stars look like. They're these beautiful pale lights. And then suddenly my eye caught one that was, it had a different set of colors to it. It was almost slightly like the aurora borealis. And I thought, oh, it's getting bigger. That's weird. It's getting bigger. And as I stood there in the forest, I realized, and this whole thing is 15 to 20 seconds. It's incredibly quick. I realized that the thing is actually coming out of the sky and is going to land, and, you know, not land like a UFO or not land like a big chunk of rock, but this strange, beautiful painted arrow, like a set of colors, just flew out of the darkness and landed about 10 foot away from me. Ironically, it landed exactly where I usually have my kitchen tent where I'm running wilderness vigils. So these days, whenever I'm pasting sandwiches, I'm looking over it, you know, where it happened. I don't know what it was. I could, you know, there's no problem for me on the one level, it could be a completely natural phenomena. But on the other, as we learn through the miraculous, the conditions in which it occurs are significant. And the fact that I was up there after 101 days, it was the end. I asked for a sign and I received something that I never could have anticipated. I must say, if you bear in mind what I'd been doing for the last 25 years, I'd been a wilderness rites of passage guide, I'd been living in my tent. I'd seen many strange things out in the wood, but nothing out of the sky. And what it did even then was it was like a distinction between the wonders of the earth and the wonders that come from the being that made the earth. That was the kind of jolt. And then when I stood up there all night, and it wasn't a frightening experience. It wasn't harrowing in any way, just baffling, beautiful. But then I came home, and then over a period of I didn't jump straight into the Christian waters. I was in denial, really. I'd seen, believe it or not, and this is the end of the really mysterious bit of it, I'd seen as I was falling asleep, these 9 words: inhabit the time and genesis of your original home. Now, I didn't like that because it said Genesis, and I also didn't understand it. Time and Genesis, what does that mean? But ironically, lockdown immediately begins. So I have the best part of a year to chew on quite what had happened. And towards the end of that period, dreams came. And they were the kind of dreams that were just unavoidably powerful. And I started to dream of a figure that I couldn't quite see. I had a dream that I was in the trenches. It was like the First World War. And I was with clearly my captain, but I couldn't see his face. And he looked at my arm and he said, you know, you've done a good job trying to fix your arm, but it's in a terrible state. And I looked down, and sure enough, my arm was like that. And he said, look, you've been through something really difficult, and I can fix your arm if you want, but I have to break it again. Do you want this? And I looked at my captain. I still couldn't see his face properly, but I said, please fix it. And if it hurt, it only hurt for a second. But from that point onwards, a great flood of dreams started to come. And suddenly this figure that had been, I'd kept at bay academically, I'd kept it at bay theoretically, was suddenly nearer to me than my own heart. And by that time, you've had it. I mean, you've absolutely had it. You would be at foolishness in the middle of your life to deny, you know, the depth of the invitation that was being offered. But as you understand, Justin, as I'm talking to you now, I know how, to some people, how nutty this will sound. But this is partially how God works, I think.
I tell you what, I mean, the phrase from Acts 2, your young men will dream dreams, your old men will see visions. I'm not saying you fall into necessarily either camp, Martin, but the point is, there's an expectation, isn't there, that somehow visionary experiences, dreams, are part of the way God communicates. Now, obviously, we live in a very rationalistic culture in the West where people are inclined to say, well, it's just, you know, the cheese you had last night, or some sort of internal bias, you know, and, you know, you're going to interpret things the way you want to. But For you, I think it's harder to deny that when you're the one experiencing that, because there's something about the power that comes with that if you're in the midst of it, is actually difficult to sort of simply say, no, that was just my imagination, that was just, a neurobiological phenomenon. That sounds to me like the sort of experience you're having there, Martin.
Yes, and I also feel that to some degree one doesn't necessarily cancel out the other. You know what I mean? All of that can be true at the same time. And it'll be what you do with it. Do you curate it? Do you look after it? Do you protect that experience and watch it grow? Or do you put it on the shelf marked strange spiritual experiences? And I elected not to do that. But I do think that I had been prepared for about 25 years for that encounter. The right relationship to nature was established. The degree of reading in which I could probably interpret something like that. But no amount of book smarts makes something like that happen. There's no amount of theoretical knowledge that can pull a light out of the sky. So I've, you are aware that on one hand you're going to be, a laughing stock. You'll lose credibility in all sorts of ways, and of course that's to a degree that happened. But the last time I checked, Jesus wasn't standing around saying, "Come with me, everything's going to be easy, and there'll be an insurance policy." He says, "Come find out." That I knew.
Yeah.
And so that, in a way, seemed like the pearl of great price.
Yeah. So the phrase that you went to bed that came to your mind, inhabit the time and genesis of your original home, was it? Did you connect that then with your Christian upbringing? Was that the sense that you were being drawn back to that story that you'd sort of put aside as something too domesticated and tame, and yet was coming back in a new way at this phase in your life? In the end, it wasn't the Baptist church, though, that you found your Christian home in. Do you want to tell us about sort of where you have found that spiritual home?
I will. So, just to finish, really, I came out of the woods. I'd gone in for 101 days, expected to become, I would say, wedded to the wild. And I came out wedded to Christ. And what happened over the next year was I realized both of these realities faced each other. They faced each other. I've called it the mossy face of Christ. So then what happens is I knew it would not be, I felt and I feel that by and large Christians do really need to find a church. You need to find your room in the many mansions, in the many mansioned place. And so I looked around, and in the end, actually, I met a lot of Christians with great hearts, and I learned to recognize Christians instinctively. There's a feeling about them. I call them worker bees, and I know that's a big part of what's going on in my own life. Is between me and you, I've had a fairly highfalutin conversion. It's been quite public. I've met all sorts of folks that are really at the cutting edge of many interesting things. But make no mistake, where the rubber meets the road with Christianity, as far as I can tell, is down in the granular detail of how I relate to other people. It's am I really showing up or not? Or am I just, on the surface of things? So in other words, it was kind of important that I didn't leave everything open to my own interpretation 24 hours a day. Because that's not healthy for me.
Yeah.
That's not healthy. So obviously I then ended up in a place where no one in my family really knew much about, which is Eastern Orthodoxy. I went into a church just as they were beginning something called Divine Liturgy. And I suddenly located all the missing elements that had been seemingly not present in the Christianity of my youth. Now, and I think we've talked about this before, you and I, a big thing in my family's evolution was the charismatic movement. And the charismatic movement was big news in the 70s and the 80s and before and after. And it had always touched me. It had always touched me. But when I went into the Divine Liturgy, I realized it was like a taste in my mouth. I thought, oh, that presence is here again. This Holy Spirit is here. But this time, through the decorum and the formality of the Divine Liturgy, it has this incredible runway into the room. It's not quite as dramatic round the sides. People are kind of falling off their chairs in the way I was used to it and enjoyed.
Yeah.
But the voltage was the same. So I've often said in my work, wildness is the dance partner of discipline. Wildness is that you need certain choreographed steps. And for me, Orthodoxy provides that. It's bigger than me. It's far older than me. It's very substantial. Much of it I struggle with.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, I'm aware that I'm really up against something of tremendous substance. So the next year I spent just showing up at church. No one would have a clue or interest in what I do outside of church. None. That's humbling.
Yeah.
You know, that's humbling. You're just there doing the kettles, doing the tea and the rest of it. And then I've just been on an enormous tour. But just before I set off on that tour, I was received in. I'd already been baptized, but I was received into the Orthodox Church, and that's where I find myself now.
Such an interesting journey you've taken there. There's something I suspect about the nature of the Orthodox Church. It's, I suppose, the fact that it does major on the kind of the immanence of God. It isn't so concerned, perhaps, with that sort of analytical sort of side. I'm sure it has its analytical side, but that maybe comes through in the Protestant tradition, in the Reformed traditions, Baptists, and so on. And obviously, the fact is very ancient. It goes right back, really, to the genesis of the church. I guess stepping into an ancient, imaginative stream kind of suits you, the way your mind and soul works, Martin.
I think it does. I'm having to come to terms with, for example, when we read from the Bible, it's chanted. It's not really read in the way that post-Reformation Christians are familiar with. And I like reading the Bible, you know, in my own voice with my own twists and turns. And that doesn't roll in Orthodoxy, and it's not going to roll in Orthodoxy, because with Orthodoxy, the clue is in the name.
Yes.
The clue is in the name. I have a joke. How many Orthodox Christians does it take to change a light bulb? Change? Probably no change. So yes, sometimes it's difficult because I have a kind of improvisational spirit. I do. But the liturgy itself, interesting things to note about it. Effectively, it's a sung theology. So we're singing rather than reading, or if we are reading, we're chanting. The liturgy itself is a very, very slow form of dance that's been going on for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And you do feel that you've moved from, this will sound a rather highfalutin analogy, but it's worth making because we have the time to do it. In poetry, there's many types of poetry, but there's one type called lyric and there's one type called epic. I grew up with lyric Christianity, not epic. Now, what that means is lyric poems have a lot of I in. They have a lot of back rub in. They have a lot of, I feel this, he's in my heart. Jesus is my friend. He's here. I'm tired. Please look after me. That kind of thing. It's very personable and I like it. But epic poetry pays far less attention to the I statement and lifts you out of that completely into this much bigger drama. Classicism is epic poetry. And I think what I found in Orthodoxy is the little I entered the big we at that moment. And that's just something about the West in general that I'm exhausted by, you know, the kind of addiction to the confessional almost. Yeah. So actually for me, it regulates my ego. And one of the things in Orthodoxy is a real distinction between what they call passion and virtue. And the world we live in these days is pretty good at passion pretty good at desire, but virtue, to make a covenant with limit, to understand what that looks like, those are the kind of things that I'm going through with orthodoxy. To distill it, finally, one more thing is, although I may look like a reasonable human being, I'm actually really a 12th century chivalric knight. I always have been. And orthodoxy is a code. It's a way of behaving in the world. You can draw it with a line. It's not massively ambiguous all the time, but there are areas where they just say it is a mystery. And I like that.
Yeah.
There's that combination.
I was going to say that picture you paint of the epic versus lyric poetry, I think even within some Western Protestant traditions, people are starting to key into the fact that some of that kind of very individualistic versions of Christianity, where it's me, Jesus, and, me getting to heaven and so on. I think thinkers like N.T. Wright and others have helped to actually say, no, you're actually part of an epic thing, this big story of God, this big movement. And it's so helpful, I think, sometimes to be reminded that it doesn't revolve around us, it revolves around God and the story God is painting. And it helps to put often our disappointments and failures into perspective as well, I find, because if the story isn't all about me, then that makes sense of the fact that I'm not always going to feel like I'm at the center of this story.
I know. As you were talking, Justin, I was thinking about Genesis, and I was thinking about this image of us as creatures of mud and holy breath. And I think that as Christians, we run the risk of forgetting that actually we're this, I think the mud, the holy breath, that's the part of us that is wired for Christian mythology. And the more culturally we take our cues from a society that has active hostility to us and has nothing to do with the teachings of Jesus, I think we have to be careful. Like you, I'm sure, I'm a great fan of Tom Holland's book, Dominion. However, I think whilst it is true that, yes, on a secular level, Christianity and many good things exist in the West because of a kind of, a Christian influence, I think it would be a foolishness to believe that as a culture that we are essentially Christian at this point. I don't think that. And you know as well as I do that Christ is always talking about cleaning the inside of the cup. We're not doing that. We're cleaning the outside of the cup, civic duty. But if we keep neglecting the inside of the cup, then I think Christianity in its most fundamental form is in real jeopardy.
Yeah. I want to come back to talking about that and others who've had similar journeys to you in recent years as well. Before we get to that, let's go back to someone who's sort of been mentioned indirectly a couple of times in this conversation. You mentioned Aslan, that idea you had of him bursting through the windows of the Baptist church. And then you even referenced, the wardrobe and the fur coats and so on. So Lewis obviously has, I presume, had some influence on your thinking and, your imagination over the years. It's very striking to me that Lewis had a perhaps not dissimilar conversion experience himself when he, grew. He was an expert in ancient mythology, literature. He found just an enormous depth of meaning and joy in reading those stories. And yet he was a very rational, intellectual person. And when he did go, he sort of had, as you I'm sure know, Martin, a sort of two-stage conversion. Firstly, from atheism to theism, he sort of just became convinced at an intellectual level there must be a sort of moral lawgiver in the universe. But his conversion to Christianity obviously was immensely helped by his friendship with J.R.R. Tolkien. They had this famous walk around Addison Walk, the back of Magdalen College, where Tolkien apparently helped Lewis to see that Jesus may be regarded as the true myth, that all those other myths that so captured Lewis's imagination actually pointed towards something that really happened. I wondered whether that sort of was in any way analogous to your experience, given your own background in mythology and so on.
Yes, of course. I mean, it's as they would say, it's a no-brainer, really, in the sense that Tolkien, Lewis, Chesterton, Barfield, Charles Williams, others, there is a very real, dynamic English Christian mythopoetic tradition that goes way back into the last century and beyond. And so, yes, of course, I related to that. I mentioned this earlier on with the Gospels. Something happens there where you find the promise of many myths all over the world arriving uncomfortably and dramatically in extraordinary form, in this area for 33 years and then out. And so, yeah, I do, of course, I relate to Lewis. I've been thinking recently, actually, that it's the fate of any Christian writer that working today that at some point you'll have an idea and then you will realize that Lewis had that idea and expressed it better about 80 years ago.
What a delight it was to chat with Martin Shaw. I think both he and Paul Kingsnorth have been on C.S. Lewis-like journeys in their own ways. And that particular interview was first recorded for the Maybe God podcast. You can find links to Martin and the full conversation with the show notes of today's episode. I hope you've enjoyed these fuller dialogues with two fascinating examples of the storytellers and poets who are being drawn towards Christ in the surprising rebirth of belief in God. I'll be continuing to bring these kinds of long-form conversations about surprising conversions in between the acts of our documentary series in future weeks. This podcast series is also a book. You can read the first chapter for free when you join my newsletter at justinbrierley.com, where you can also order the book or even get a signed copy. Today's episode was a production of Think Faith in partnership with Genexus and with support from the Jerusalem Trust. Also, a special shout out on this episode to Dave Mattox, Chris Heasley and Robert Lee White for generous support of this show that's helped us to continue bringing you these weekly episodes so far. But as we come towards the end of the year, your support really will help us to continue bringing quality podcasts, videos and more resources for thinking faith in the new year. I'm passionate about bringing the Christian and non-Christian world into conversation, and your support makes a huge difference. You can give through Patreon, PayPal or tax-deductible giving from the USA. The links are all with today's show. Coming up next time.
This worried me more and more, and it was kind of like I was thinking, well, I'm clearly not, as I'd vaguely imagined, the heir of the Greeks and the Romans in any way, really. And I began to realise that actually, in almost every way, I am Christian.
History Maker. We return to our documentary series format as we find out why Tom Holland changed his mind about Jesus and looking at the story that shaped our world. That'll be coming your way in 2 weeks' time as we take a short break over New Year. As ever, please do subscribe to this podcast, rate and review us, share it on social media to help others to discover this series. Plus, you can get the next episode you just heard a clip from right now when you support at justinbrierley.com. The link again is with today's show. Your support makes a huge difference as we head into 2024. So Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and see you next time.
Thanks for listening today, and to Ellis, who left this review saying, one of the best podcasts I've ever listened to. Historical, insightful, reasoned, and full of heart. So necessary in a culture that has forgotten why it is like it is. Just bought the book too. If you can leave a review, it helps others to discover the show. And if you want to buy the book, like Ellis did, you can get a signed copy from my website. As it happens, gold supporters of this show get signed editions of both my books anyway, plus lots of bonus content and early access. And of course, your support makes a huge difference to me being able to produce this podcast. So for the book or to support, visit justinbrierley.com or follow the links with the show notes.